Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Chris Ellis, the CEO of Finder Australia, also known as the Work From Home CEO. I joined Finder almost 12 months ago, just as the country was switching to remote work following the arrival of the pandemic in Australia. So it's great for me at least to be here in the Finder offices talking to you. Firstly, I want to introduce Finder to any of you that might not know us so well. We're Australia's most visited comparison website with more than 2.5 million visitors each month. Our core purpose is that we exist to help people make better financial decisions. And we do that in pretty much any category you can think of, from credit cards to home loans to energy to broadband and to insurance. So in today's event, we're looking specifically at the role that gender plays on personal financial outcomes in Australia. And I'll let our amazing panel do most of the talking on that topic. And welcome to the panel. It's a very important topic to me personally. I have a fundamental belief in the importance of equality in every dimension of that word, whether it be skin color, the background that you come from, and your gender. And I also note, by the way, that gender is more nuanced than purely male or female. But that said, today we come together to highlight and explore the differences between men and women in regards to personal finances. The report we've put together makes for great and sometimes I think challenging and difficult reading, which I think is a good thing and a necessary thing. And I'm excited to learn from the amazing panel that we've assembled today. There will be plenty of time for questions for the panel at the end of the event, but if you have any questions on Finder, then please direct them to me or some of the other Finder team. So now, I think as the only man speaking today, I've held the mic long enough, so I'm pleased to be handing over to our wonderful Senior Home Loans Editor, Sarah Megginson, to take us through from here.
Thank you so much for that intro, Chris, and welcome everyone to today's session From Pay Gap to Parity. My name is Sarah Megginson and I'm Senior Editor of Home Loans for Finder.com.au. And today we're going to take a deep dive into the relationship between gender and personal finances. It's something that I'm really super passionate about personally. It's actually the fastest growing demographic is single women aged 50 years and over. It makes this a really important and necessary conversation that we have to have around females and finance and how they're setting themselves up for their future. So we have a fantastic panel of speakers, which I'll introduce in a moment. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. So we're going to start each section of the panel discussion with a few findings from our consumer report. We have around 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. So if you have any questions along the way, you can submit it as a comment on our YouTube channel. There'll be a link there as well that you can pop a question in there if you've got one for us. After the event, we're going to send the report to everyone. And there's going to be a little feedback form as well. So if you can check your inboxes at the end, that'd be great. But first, we're going to get stuck into it and introduce our panelists. So without further delay, let me introduce you to our first panelist, Fiona Guthrie, who is CEO of Financial Counselling Australia and the National Debt Helpline. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Fiona.
Hi, Sarah. Well, I've been the CEO of Financial Counselling Australia for over a decade now, and it's a job I'm very passionate about. It's lovely to get paid to do something you really care about. Financial counsellors help people in financial hardship, and the National Debt Helpline, we coordinate that service around Australia. Last year it received 130,000 phone calls. The year before it was 180, and it was a little bit quieter this year just because I think so much government support and stimulus have been in the economy and fewer people are experiencing difficulties, so that was really positive.
Wow, there's some staggering statistics though. That's a lot of people who need your resources and your support. So I'm really excited to chat further with you in a moment. We also have Christina Hobbs, CEO and co-founder of Verve Super. Hi, Christina.
Hi, thanks for having me today. We founded Verve a little over 2 years ago as Australia's first superannuation fund to be led by women and tailored specifically for women. And our mission is really focused on closing that retirement savings gap between men and women. So we really work to support women to build their wealth and also as an ethical fund to invest that wealth in a better world. And we do that through a really big emphasis on providing free financial coaching to our members to help them build their skills and to meet like-minded women that they can learn from. We also manage this through our ethical investments. So we invest ethically, but we also invest in initiatives that specifically support women. And a third really important part about what we do is also our advocacy. So making certain that we're also focusing effort on trying to bring in some of those policy changes that would make a really big difference to the long-term financial lives of women.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, about that gap between men and women in their super balances. And great to hear some of the things you're going to be doing to help women with that. We also have Lucy Dean, Women's Wealth Editor of Yahoo Finance. Welcome, Lucy.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Christina. Hi, Fiona. I'm so excited to be talking to you guys today. It's so unusual being on the other side of the desk. Normally, I'm the one asking the question, so it's really fun to switch it up.
I think it's going to be some really great discussions happening today. So we'll jump right in. Before we get into the data, I want to look at a little bit of a situation of where we are at the moment. So Australia has actually come a really long way in pursuit of gender equality so far. The pay gap is closing, and women are starting to catch up with men in terms of superannuation, although there is still a pretty big gap there between superannuation balances. Overall, net wealth is beginning to equalise, and despite what gender stereotypes might reinforce, women are actually really great money managers. So when we were putting this report together, our insights team at Finder found that women are actually really credit savvy. They're less likely to have credit card debt, and the debts that they do have is lower on average than men. They're also less likely to be rejected for a financial product, which means after applying for a loan, women are less likely to hear no than a man. And women also have higher credit scores. So overall, the picture is kind of painted that women are really good at managing money. They're also really responsible with their money. So our report found that 2/3 of women consider themselves to be savers, whereas only 57% of men kind of categorise themselves like that. And it also revealed that men were a bit more likely to spend JobKeeper money on things that maybe they didn't quite need, streaming services, online subscriptions and gaming, whereas women were a little bit more frugal, save their money for a rainy day. So far, it's a really interesting story of women being quite good at managing their money. But what has also come out of the report is that women are also really savvy investors. So there's a number of studies that show that female investors are more successful on average than male investors. A number of these studies pointed to the fact that it was a long-term approach rather than a speculative approach to investing that was a key driver of their results. One of these studies, for example, revealed that over a 17-year period, female investors were consistently outperforming their male counterparts. So we're going to dive into some of these trends here. There seems to be this trend emerging that women are more conservative with their money and men are more likely to take risks. But I want to talk about whether that comes down to women actually being more responsible, or is it that there is a bit of a lack of confidence to take these risks? So, Lucy, I'm going to start off with you on this one. How do you think we tackle some of these misconceptions that women are bad with money?
So this is something that really, really frustrates me, this idea that we're bad with money, because it's just not true. But I think there's 3 parts to tackling this misconception, and it actually starts at childhood. So we know that girls are paid $9 a week in pocket money on average, while boys are paid $13.60 a week. And it's not that boys are doing more housework, it's the opposite. We're just paying girls less. So we need to start there. We need to think about the messages that we're sending to our kids in terms of the work that we value and the work that earns the most money. So that's the first step. The second step leads on from there, and that's tackling our own assumptions about money and thinking about the behaviour that we model to our kids and actually to our friends as well. So we know, for example, that girls are growing up financially disadvantaged in Australia because they're not as involved in the family's financial discussions as the boys are. That's a study that came up, I think only a few weeks ago, but it's found that we're just not talking to our girls about money in the same way that we're talking to boys. And there was another study that found that girls and boys at 15 have got the same levels of financial literacy, but the way that they think about money is actually radically different. So boys are more likely to be talking about money, they're more likely to be engaged with it, they're happy to chat about it with their friends, whereas girls at 15, we think that it's not relevant to us. So we really need to ask, why is that happening? And it's something that we actually also see extend into adulthood. So, I mean, how many guys do we know who have got WhatsApp groups, where they're talking about GameStop and the ETFs that they're investing in and all the different things they're doing? And then how many girls do we know, how many women do we know who are doing the same thing? And I mean, I know that among my friendship group, I don't know many at all who are doing that. And that's, I mean, that is something that we're trying to solve at Yahoo Finance with our Women's Money Movement. Same thing you guys are doing here, but it's definitely something that needs to be a bigger community discussion around, I guess, just bringing up the conversations. And that's the third point, actually. So it's events like these are critical in breaking those misconceptions in the same way that talking to our friends, our sisters, our mums, our daughters about money, because there's that saying that you're the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And obviously there's limits to that. But in this instance, I think it's a really interesting way to look at money. So if we know that we're spending all that time talking to people who are open about their investment strategy and talking about, and, you know, open about their budget and open about their goals, likely to think that that behaviour is normal and we're going to replicate it ourselves.
It's so interesting there that we're talking about it starting so early, so young, that these kind of mindsets and habits and money routines are kind of, you know, they're entrenched from a really young age. So Christina, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more. You know, these kind of events and these kind of discussions are really important in helping to, you know, just engage women more in these money conversations. Do you think that you're starting to see more women have an interest in their superannuation and their investments, and they're wanting to be a bit more proactive about it?
Yeah, certainly. Before we founded Verve, we actually surveyed over 1,000 women to ask them what was missing from their current financial services, what would they like more of, and we really just saw this just enormous hunger for people wanting to learn more and more. And I think that a key part of that is that, and particularly around superannuation, but I think wealth in general, is that there is so much acknowledgement now of that retirement savings gap. And I think there's been so much in the media about women not being able to manage their money well, that I think that women are starting to really focus and ask themselves what they can do more. But I think just building on from what's already been said, is that I think a lot of the reason behind this narrative of that women can't manage their money well is really a form of victim blaming. And when you look at things like pay inequality, when you look at things like our retirement system, which was never really established to support women, when you look at the poor levels we have in this country of parental leave, affordable childcare, and compare that to other countries in the OECD, it's really no surprise that women are being left behind. But over and over again, we see these reports being released that really try to push the blame towards women. And I think it's quite easy for certain politicians and people in the media to continue that narrative instead of trying to really challenge what the causes of financial inequality are in Australia. And so I think one of the wonderful things that is in this Finder report is that you've actually highlighted all these areas where women are actually excellent money managers, and I would really love to see more of that.
Yeah, and I think that's the point, is that women are actually capable of a lot more, but there's a lot, there's so many different factors at play here. And Fiona, I wanted to talk to you a little bit on that side of the fact that we're talking about super and kind of future finances, but you're dealing with people who are kind of in the thick of financial difficulty right now. So when you're in financial stress, the idea of thinking about your future in your super when you retire is so far off into the future. What are some of the big issues that you're seeing, you know, particularly after the pandemic, that you're seeing women struggle with the most?
Well, what Lucy said really resonated for me about how we don't talk enough about money. I think that's across the community. I sometimes say that we're more likely to talk about our sex lives than we are to talk about our financial position. And so when people come to see a financial counsellor, it's a time of great stress, obviously. And so your point about superannuation being a long way away, your focus is really on, can I pay my utility bill, can I pay my rent, can I pay my mortgage, what do I do about the debt collector? So it's very short time frame. But because we don't talk about money openly in our community, people have a sense of shame, and they shouldn't. And so one of the things I think that would help us all is being more open about our financial positions. And this idea that women are bad at money, I hadn't really heard that very much before, because I actually think women are really, really good at money. And people on low incomes are incredibly good at money because they have to be. I mean, the biggest shift, one of the biggest shifts we've seen in society in the last 100 or so years has been the role of women. And so what we need to do, I think, to think about addressing this issue, if there is a gap, to have these kind of conversations, it starts with awareness. It's a culture that's required.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, the last 12 months have shaken things up in a lot of different ways, some positive, some negative. You know, the economic recession that we had was a financial shock for most Australians, but it had a really disproportionate effect on women who, through the pandemic, were more likely to suffer from job losses and financial distress. So in our report, we found that women were more likely to have been impacted at work. Between March and June, the female unemployment rate amongst those searching for full-time work actually jumped 9%, and the female labour market shrunk at the same time. And we also saw the savings gap grow. So the amount of savings that men and women had in the bank grew by, it's now sitting at around $14,000. So men have almost $40,000 in savings on average, whereas women are around the $25,000 mark. So we've got this situation where women have been more financially impacted through the pandemic. And to go back to what you were saying before, Fiona, you know, there's that short-term focus of what's exactly happening right in front of us. At the beginning of the pandemic, a Finder survey revealed that half of women said they felt financially unprepared for what was ahead. So with women being disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, you know, specifically related to COVID, Fiona, what have you seen on the front line when it comes to those financial challenges that women are facing?
Well, our data didn't show an uptick in the number of women compared to men during the pandemic. So it stayed around between 55 to 60%. So we always had more females than males talk to financial counsellors. For what reason? I'm never certain. Perhaps some of your data might shed a light on that, but women might be more likely to more open to asking for assistance. But the big trend, and it's been reported by lots of community organisations, was we saw more women talking to us about family violence. And the issue that was quite distressing for a number of us to hear about was how sometimes perpetrators of family violence were first forcing women to access their superannuation early because the government allowed you to do 2 bites of $10,000. And so they were being forced into accessing their superannuation, possibly cleaning out their account balances. And so, but not for their benefit, but for the perpetrator's benefit. I don't know whether that rings a bell with you, Christina, at Verve Super, but it's something that we alerted the government to when we saw it happening, because they really didn't have very many checks and balances in around that process.
And it was such a short-term solution. It was an emergency solution and a short-term thing, but the impact of it to take $10,000 out, I know a lot of people that took it out for things that, it wasn't an emergency. It was, for lifestyle purchases. But I remember there was some research at the time that showed something like taking $10,000 out now, if you don't replace it, you could be losing, upwards of $100,000 once you compound that towards retirement. So Christina, what kind of trends did you notice around, this must have been quite a big impact on you when that measure got introduced. What kind of trends did you notice with people women taking their money out of super?
Yeah, it was a huge year for us because it was on one hand processing these withdrawals and working with members to do that. And on the other hand, we also provide both free financial coaching, but we also have a free divorce coach for our members and career coach, pay negotiator. And so those coaches were really going over the drive. And I think just to echo what Fiona said, we were also, our divorce and separation coach was just being inundated by similar complaints, either financially controlling situations or women needing to work out the financial side of that. So that was huge. From the superannuation side, I think for our members, we did a lot of messaging around what are the risks of taking money out, but also being really sensitive that I think a lot of the women that were taking money out were acutely aware of what they were doing to their future balances. But as Fiona's heard, when you can't pay bills and you can't put food on the table, you have to make those decisions. So it was a really emotional time for a lot of people, and I think most people, certainly most of our members that took that money out, really, really needed it. And there is an acute awareness that that's now going to leave a huge gap in their balances. And while we do know that research shows that women are actually more likely to establish additional contributions and to try to build their balances over time, because of all these other financial inequalities that women face, those amounts are smaller and their capacity to actually do that is smaller. And so what I really fear is that we've just kicked the problem of financial insecurity down the road for another 30 years. And that the people that have taken out $20,000 now, that's going to be a huge portion of what they should have had later in life. So I would really like to see, potentially more and additional incentives to support women to put more super back in, or to look at where some of the gaps are that we can solve to sort women build up their balances again in particular. Particularly because we do know from research that's coming out, particularly research in Victoria, that it is women who did lose their jobs that are actually facing, more likely to face longer-term structural unemployment now. So although COVID's largely kind of, I won't want to say over, but peak COVID is kind of coming to an end and we see hope on the horizon, certainly the long-term impacts are going to be felt for years to come.
Yeah, and on that point of the jobs, I think the official statistic was something like 880,000 jobs were lost between March and May last year, and certainly not all of those jobs have been recovered. So there's a lot of challenges ahead. But just to kind of finalise our chat on the COVID side of things, Lucy, you would have done a lot of reporting on so many different trends and things that have happened as a result of COVID over the last 12 months. What have you seen around, I guess, the financial habits or attitudes of women, how that have changed through the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think we've seen those two narratives that Christina and Fiona have been talking about. So we've obviously seen a massive uptick in interest on stories about budgeting and stories about how to save that extra bit of money. And we've also seen a massive amount of interest on superannuation stories. So one of our most read stories last year was on the amount of money that I guess you should have in your super account, and then I guess going through that and talking about whether that's realistic and what that actually means and what those numbers mean for you. So that's been on the story front. But in terms of our readership, we've actually seen a massive increase in the number of female readers who are coming to our site. And that's something that I know we're seeing it everywhere. So, for example, the ASX put out a report that found that 45% of new investors last year were women. And obviously that's not 50-50, but if we compare that to 5 years ago, that number was 31%. So wow. It's obvious that there were people, a lot of women who maybe did have that, I guess, a bit of a windfall. They're working from home, or even just they were more engaged with their finances, and they realised, ooh, do you know what? My mate's been made redundant. My dad his job is looking pretty insecure. I might need to start thinking about other ways to shore up my finances. And so they've been really looking at starting to invest. And we also saw this with an event we put on last year. We had to cancel because of COVID, but it was about women and it was about investors. So that's been a big thing. There's been a massive uptick just in interest in how to invest and how to begin that journey.
Which is really, really positive. That kind of the whole process starts with awareness and education. And the more that we have these discussions and the more we shine a light on money and choices and how money gives you choices, the more that people are going to engage with this.
Yeah.
So we've covered kind of what women do really well and how they felt the effects of COVID. So now we're going to explore some of the gaps that still exist and how we might work to close them. So the continued existence of the gender pay gap is a key driver for some of these differences that we've identified in the Finder report, but it's not the only one. Gaps also exist when it comes to financial literacy, investing confidence, and the cost of goods. So women's financial position overall is worse than men on average. They generally have less in savings and less in their superannuation funds. And a bit of an alarming statistic is that 1 in 7 women say they could only survive off their savings for a week or less in an emergency, compared to just 9% of men. So women are also more likely to feel the effects of an increase to their rent or their mortgage. Women are also more likely to experience debt. They're more likely to have some kind of debt. 2/3 of women say they have some form of debt, compared to closer to 50% of men. And when it comes to buy now, pay later kind of schemes and programs, both men and women use it around the same amount, but women are spending more on these kind of programs. So with all of that comes the fact that women are also less likely to be investing. Only 21% of Australian women are investing in shares, compared to more than 1/3 of men. Women also generally overall have lower levels of financial literacy, which is something that we've kind of touched on with the fact that that starts really early and at a young age. And this gap is getting particularly large for superannuation. And when it comes to things like income protection insurance, there's a big gap there, around 11% of a difference between men and women who take out this kind of coverage. So I want to talk now a little bit about the biggest drivers of these financial gaps that still exist. And does it come down to a difference in levels of understanding, or is it a lack of confidence, or what is it that is causing this gap? Even though we're making progress on it, it's still there. So Christina, when it comes to super, there is that's still quite a big gap there. What do you think women can do to put themselves in a better position for retirement?
Yeah, so I think firstly, there's a lot that anyone can do, and I think Fiona touched on this, is that we need to be having more financial conversations. And I think simple things like understanding how much you might need in retirement, and this is really when we do coaching around superannuation or around investment, we have a very sort of set process, which is talking to our members about how much might you need in retirement, where are you now, how are you tracking, and what are your options to getting to your goals. And I think just sort of having that very high level understanding and moment with yourself and taking time to set a plan can be incredibly reassuring for people and can really support people on their journey to learning more about how to build their superannuation and the benefits of doing that. But I think on the other hand, we have to be really, really clear that the reason that there is such a big super gap in Australia, 35%, is simply the policies that we have in place that create financial inequality throughout a woman's life. And superannuation is really just the end point of that, which shows that lifelong inequality. And I've already mentioned some of those things, but not being able to access affordable childcare, really simple things. I think if we look at pay inequality, I think, again, a lot of the focus has been pushed for women to negotiate harder. Pay discrimination is illegal in this country, yet we haven't really seen the government putting focus on actually putting in place the mechanisms that would allow people to actually sue their employers if that was the case in their workplaces. We've seen other countries relate, for instance, country-level pay inequality data. Now, our government collects that data but won't provide it at a company level. That's been hugely successful in other countries to close pay inequality. So there are simple policies that we could put in place to close this gap, but until we see some of those big ones in Australia, we're not going to see much of a closing of this gap. And I think when we look at superannuation inequality, one of the big myths that a lot of people have, and particularly younger women, is that this gap's not going to affect me. That this gap is this gap exists because back in the 50s and 60s, women couldn't, weren't allowed to work or keep their jobs after they got married, but this isn't something that applies to me anymore. But the reality, we put out a big report last year on this, and the reality is that retirement inequality is going to remain for young women today, and that we're on track that the majority of young women today will again retire dependent on their partners if they have one, or on the old age pension, which is currently sort of below the poverty line for most people. And so we really need urgent action to create a system in Australia that would allow for retirement equality.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of those things you mentioned there, like having to rely on a partner in retirement, that doesn't create much freedom or choice. So we definitely need to do more to address these types of things. Lucy, what would your kind of perspective be on women who want to be a bit more proactive? They want to make better strides with their investments, or just become a bit more engaged in their money management and how to invest. What would your advice be, your starting point for women who want to step up their kind of involvement in investing?
I think I would start by, the thing is that we know that the two biggest barriers to women investing, it's not a lack of confidence and it's not a lack of understanding, it's the belief that it takes a lot of money and that it takes a lot of time. And so, neither of those are necessarily untrue, but there's a lot more nuance to it that I think we are aware of. So, for example, you could start investing with Contact Pocket for $50, or you could pick up an investment app like Raise you can start with that's micro investing. That's dollars and cents. you're probably not going to get massive returns on that, but it's a good little introduction. It's kind of like a bike with training wheels. You get used to seeing the way that the market moves. And in terms of the time piece, this is something I actually did an experiment, I guess, on myself last year, because I didn't grow up in a family that invested. We never spoke about it, but I was like, do you know what? I've got to do it. I've got to jump in. And I decided I wanted to invest in an ETF, which is an exchange traded fund. Did my research, figured out the one I wanted to put my money into, decided how much I wanted to put in, and then from the beginning to the end of the actual process of setting up the account to actually having the investment, it only took me like an hour. And now I just check the investment on an app on my phone, I guess once a week, see how it's going, decide if I want to put more in. And the thing is that initial stage, like the research took a bit of time because you can't just go around investing willy-nilly. You want to know what you're putting your money into. It wasn't a crazy amount of time. Now that I'm in there, I know how it works. And so the ability to do it again and again and again, it's become so much easier. So that would be that I would say. It's not as expensive and it's not as time consuming as you think it is. But also it does come down a bit more to the industry as well. So women, we know that women also don't think that investment products are made with them in mind. So like we were talking about before, we know that we're more risk. But it's also because we're more interested in investing in line with our goals. So I think there's probably an opening for the industry to do more to create products that speak to that desire that comes from women. And we also want our investment providers to be more open on fees. We want to be transparent because, as we've spoken about, we don't have as much money. We're getting paid less.
Lucy, we can't hear Lucy. Sorry about that.
Oh.
A little technical difficulty there. Sorry, Lucy, we just lost you there for a second. I guess, Fiona, we'll just jump into you really quickly because we're talking about these trends to do with how to invest and how to, build your financial literacy. But you're kind of still at that front line of people dealing with debt. And that doesn't mean it should exclude you from being able to invest or to think about your financial future. So what's kind of your advice for people that may be in a difficult financial position or they may have like financial stress? So the idea of investing seems so foreign to them, but we still want to give them the opportunity to kind of, make headway in that regard. What's your advice or your number one tips for people who are struggling with debt, but they want to get out of that situation?
Okay. I hope we can come back to Lucy. She was saying some really interesting things there about products for women around investment, which were really, really good. Certainly if you've got debt, I don't think you'd be thinking about investing till you've got rid of the debt. That does not make logical sense to me. I wouldn't be otherwise by someone else. But the debt figures, the debt figure that worried me in the data you have in the report, Sarah, was the growth in buy now, pay later debt, which was double for women compared to men. And buy now, pay later debt sits outside our regulatory framework, so there are less safeguards. And in our world of financial counselling, we see clients who are struggling with buy now, pay later debt in the same way a few years ago we would have seen them struggling with credit card debt. So I would just be very cautious about that. I don't think I'm the right person to talk about best tips for investments, but best tips for getting rid of your debt. You either find your debt that's got the lowest interest rate or the smallest amount and choose which one you want to go for and get rid of them.
Great. Okay. So I also wanted to talk a little bit, something we haven't touched on yet really, but it is really part of the wealth and money discussion is property, that women are getting more engaged in the property process. Women are starting to want to buy property, on a single income, I guess. They're not waiting for a man so much anymore to buy a property. And there are schemes and things at the moment, like the first home loan deposit scheme that make it possible for you to buy a property with just a 5% deposit. And your home is going to be, for a lot of people, it's going to be the biggest asset they have. So more broadly, I guess, Lucy, this is probably a question for you. What would you say your advice is for people that, particularly at the moment, we're seeing property in headlines all the time, that prices are going up and people are worried it's going to be out of reach and unaffordable. What would your advice be for people that are looking at property as being that vehicle they're going to use to, kind of to build their wealth and to have an asset? What would your advice be for them?
Well, my advice would be, I guess, to really think about the timing. So I've done about 2 or 3 stories in the last week just on this FOMO that's like rushing market. Everyone is freaking out a little bit, and we're all dying to get in. And so that'll be my biggest tip, would be just make sure that you're not actually biting off more than you can chew, because we know that interest rates are way down there. But they are going to start increasing probably in a few years. So you want to make sure that you haven't got this massive loan that you're going to be lumped with, and especially given that we know that responsible lending laws are also in the headlights. So they're looking at changing them to make it easier for people to get loans, but there's also concerns. I'm sure that Fiona would have a few opinions on I guess, the dilution of these lending laws. So I'll be carefully at that. And I would also be looking at, it also comes down to your interest rate. So make sure that you're shopping around and getting the best rate that you can, because, yeah, obviously don't bite off more than you can chew, but also make sure that you are taking advantage of these ultra low interest rates. We know that they're super low. And I guess also consider getting an offset account, because once you're in there, it means that you can offset the value of the size of the mortgage. I know that Nicole Peterson McKinnon, super duper financial woman, she describes it as Australian property gem because it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So make sure you get an offset account if it works for you.
Yes, offset accounts are amazing, and everyone should get one if you can. They're just a way to reduce the amount of interest you pay and own your home sooner. So I think it should be mandatory for all banks to explain what an offset account is when you get a loan. Yeah. But that doesn't always happen. I had a loan for 3 years before I figured out what an offset account was, and I was really dirty. No. I should have told us this. Look, we're going to wrap up in a minute and move on to a Q&A. Before we do, I just wanted to finish with one final question for everyone, which boils down to financial literacy for women. What do you think the financial services industry as a whole can do, for women to improve financial literacy? And Christina, I guess you're kind of leading the charge here with, you've got a number of programs in place, from a superannuation perspective, from a provider's perspective, you've got a number of programs in place to help with that financial literacy and financial counselling. Is that something you'd like to see expanded more broadly across the industry?
Yeah, certainly. And I think, there's a role for what financial service providers be providing, and then what other external players can be as well. But for us, it was really looking at just this huge unmet need, and particularly when it comes to women, there's amazing data that shows that women would actually rather get financial advice and support from a professional, but they're far less likely to access it due to cost and also due to not trusting those professionals. And so I think there just is a wonderful opportunity as a service provider to provide what we call general advice or coaching. It's not telling people or suggesting people about specific products or what they should do, but really explaining the foundations of financials. And we do that for everything from debt through to basic property decisions, investing. And we find that for our members, it is meeting this enormous unmet need. And so I do think there's a huge opportunity there. I think we're seeing other financial institutions starting to do more as well. I think is great. And I think particularly around women, it is very important to think about how those spaces and those events can be tailored for women, can be inclusive of women, can feel like safe spaces for women. So I definitely think there's, enormous opportunity out there for the industry to do more and to provide that service.
Yeah, 100%. And obviously, Fiona, your job, your career is built around financial literacy and helping people, make more informed decisions. But I guess by the time you end up working with a lot of people, they've kind of gone down a path that has got them, in a bit of financial trouble. So what would you like to see? What are the biggest changes you would like to see happen across the industry to help, I guess, not fix, but look at these issues before they become such a crisis for people at an individual level?
Well, I think we need to just backtrack for a second. So you said to me then that we've seen people get themselves into trouble and they need to make better choices. The reasons people see financial counsellors or struggle are generally because of external factors. They lose their job. We've just seen this in the pandemic at a huge rate. They get sick, or a child gets sick, or a partner gets cancer, or their relationship breaks down and their income reduces. Or they're living in poverty because they live on a really low rate of job seeker. So it's often not, we've got to be very careful, I think. So I would say be very cautious about language which blames people for their own situations, and look at the structural and the systemic constructs which have caused them to be in that position. And the women's pay gap and the lower superannuation is a structural problem, primarily. And financial hardship is primarily a structural problem. And while there is a role there for financial institutions to provide financial literacy, it's not the cause of financial hardship. And I am always just a tiny bit sceptical. I think we should take it with a grain of salt when financial literacy is provided by financial institutions which have an interest in telling you to take on more debt and buy more of their products. I would go to Money Smart, fantastic website where I'd get involved with. I love this idea of WhatsApp groups for women interested in investing and learning from each other. I think that would be really good. So I'm not saying there's no role for financial literacy in this financial literacy space. I'm just saying be a little bit cautious.
Always good advice, I think. And Lucy, what's your perspective on this? What do you think the industry could be doing better to just help women kind of engage with a better level of financial literacy?
So basically, I mean, talking about the industry, I think they've got this image problem, basically. So following they really, I guess their reputation is really damaged, but this is now an opportunity for them to reassess who they are and what they do. And I think it really comes down to rethinking their market. So when you think of investing, you think of a white man in a suit, shouting at a screen, buy low, sell high, GameStop, yada, yada. But it doesn't need to be like that. And I don't think that the investment industry has actually caught up to that either. I don't know that they're talking to the mum who is, racing between 3 different sports appointments and thinking about the food practice and wanting to book the doctor's appointment and also trying to figure out how to cook dinner on a budget. I think that as soon as the investment industry actually realizes, hey, these guys, they're investors too, then their product's going to shift. They're going to be more targeted to people with these wants and these needs and these goals. And then it means that more women are going to be starting to invest in a way that's safer, that's more appropriate for what they desire. And we know that we learn the most by doing. So it's starting small. So the industry needs to build the products that women want, because then we will start to use the products. And then just by doing it, we learn and our financial literacy improves. And that the obvious extension to that would be that we need to hire more women into these roles, and not just women. It comes down to youth. It comes down to people with disabilities, people from different cultures and backgrounds, and making the whole sector more diverse. We've got more diversity of thought, and the products, I guess, relate better to different people's needs.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of good points there. Look, we're going to move on to the Q&A now. And we've got a number of really interesting questions that have come through. I'm going to start with this first one, which is for you, Christina. We've had someone ask the question that Christina mentioned that the existing superannuation system doesn't necessarily support women. What can women do to get on the front foot and bolster their retirement funds?
Yeah, such a good question. And I think just by asking that question, you're already along your journey, because I see so many women that are sort of, I don't want to look at my balance. So I think the first thing is, no matter what age you are, is that you can make a difference. And superannuation is very much about a lifelong journey. But if you think about it, even if you're in your 50s, you've still got well over 10 years before you retire. And then once you are retired, you still have many, many more years for your savings to build up. And so I think, just first of all, no matter what age you're at, it's the right age to start. There's great incentives there can be great tax incentives for investing more through your superannuation. So I think exploring how those potential tax incentives could benefit you. So there's things like salary sacrificing, for instance, or just making additional contributions which are pre-income tax. And so if you meet the requirements, you can pop on the website and look. Then you can actually add more money to your super, not pay your income tax on that. And so there are these opportunities for building up super that can make really good sense to you. I think really just going back to, really using some simple tools. We've got some on our website. There's some great ones on the Money Smart website. Having a look at what you might need in retirement, not being afraid to have a look at your current balance and see where you are, and then really work out how you're going to bridge that gap, whether it's through additional contributions or looking at things you can do outside of superannuation. Another great one that I'm really passionate about is looking at how to make retirement fair in relationships. So there's also opportunities that if you take time out of the workforce, that your partner can split their superannuation with you, can contribute to your superannuation. And depending on how you manage your money in your relationship, you might really like a model like that, where when you retire, the actual superannuation income that you both have is more fair because of how you divided it up throughout your partnership. So there are some really good opportunities. Feel free to pop on our website. We write a lot on this topic.
Awesome. Thank you, Christina. We've had this question come through twice for you, Lucy, so I think it's time to jump to this one. What finance apps and tools would you recommend for people who want to kind of take better control, better money management?
Well, Yahoo Finance is a great place to start. Finder too, obviously great for comparisons. In terms of apps and tools, do you know what? There are so many. I think one of the things that I haven't really spoken about today is the power of automation. So the ability to just automate your life. You know, if you can decide not to worry about bills because you've got it going out that way and going out that way, then you can do that. And I know that there's one that I love. It's called Shopback, and it means that when you shop through a site, they get paid a bit of a commission because you're shopping through Shopback, and then you get a bit of money back. So you actually make money through shopping. And I love that one. That's one of my favorite tools in terms of making money without realizing it. I quite like eToro for investing. It's a social trading app, so you follow individual investors and you invest the way that they invest, which is something that you might want to consider if you're starting out. And I also use BetaShares for their ETFs. I think that they're just a great ETF provider. There are a million different apps. We've got a bunch of stories, and I know that Finder as well does a comparison of a lot of apps, but I need to think, there's so many, it's hard to pick my favorite.
Remiss of me not to share my favorite, the Finder app, of course. Our app, is a really great place to start if you're wanting to just get an overview of your financial situation, and there are really immediate ways that you can save money by comparing different products and starting to save money. So that's kind of our mission here at Finder, is to help people make better decisions, better financial decisions every day. So our app is a great place to start there. Another really interesting question has come through. I'm going to throw this open to the panel, whoever feels like they might have an answer for this. But for men who want to be allies to women, what is the kind of action that they can take to support gender pay parity? Any thoughts on that? It's a very big question. I like it.
Yeah, I can answer a little bit. So I think one thing is on the personal level. So looking at how you can personally support a woman. I like supporting women to learn how to negotiate, to practice, to role play. My partner actually manages women, and he has really encouraged them to negotiate with him and has sort of trained them to negotiate with him to increase their salaries. So I think that can be super beneficial. But then within your workplace more broadly, being an advocate, so does your workplace pay inequality data? If they don't, why don't they? I think asking for that kind of information, asking for information about pay parity at different levels, and generally being a promoter of those kind of policies is amazing, because if a woman asks senior management, why aren't we releasing pay inequality data, or can I get an understanding of this? It can often be a lot harder than if a man does it who's not personally involved in it. And so I think really kind of taking both the personal, supporting women at an individual level, but also providing support within a company level is really important.
I also really love Christina's point.
Another question has come through that anyone is welcome to jump in on this one. I think it's a very thought-provoking question. For girls who are being born in 2021, what financial future do you think they have to look forward to on this one?
Well, I'm about to be a grandmother of one of those girls. She's arriving in May. It's very uncertain, I think. I'd like to think it's better. I'd like to think
I think I was born, I'm almost 40, so when I was born, the opportunities for women then were very different to what they were. Even my grandma couldn't get a mortgage by herself, even though she worked, which was very unusual for her time, but she couldn't get a mortgage simply because she was female. So they missed out on a home. They lost their home.
You still needed a signature from your husband. I think even in the 90s. Yeah.
There's still so much. We've come a really long way, but there is still so much, that we still have to go. But it's very interesting. I don't have any immediate answer to that. I think that is such a thought-provoking question about what kind of women have to look forward to. But hopefully they will continue to make strides ahead, and there will be, more and more of these discussions. I think awareness and discussion is, the first step towards making change. So I've got a couple more questions before we're going to finish up. This one is it's actually open to anyone. But the question was, you've mentioned that the gender pay gap has been gradually becoming smaller. What do you think has been contributing to this, and what can we do to continue to close the gap?
I might comment a bit on that one because I've actually looked at this data quite a lot, and it's quite interesting when you look at a long-term trend, because there is a gradual decline, but we've also seen decline with then peaks going back up again and down again. And what we're seeing in terms of decline is quite minuscule. We're not seeing sort of big changes that we've seen in other countries where they've actually brought in structural changes to really try to address it. And there is a lot of suggestion from some economists that I've spoken to about this, that some of the decline that we've seen in recent years is actually more in relation to dominance of different industries. So if we look at industries like mining, for instance, that have a heavy number of employees with high salaries, depending on what's happening with that individual sector, for instance, whether it's in a boom or a reduction period, actually has a significant impact on how the overall pay gap is calculated. And so what I would say is that, if we look at a long-term trend, yes, there's decline. It's very small. A lot of the declines that we see reported year to year are actually more related to industry fluctuations that impact how that gap is reported, and that we're not going to see really significant changes in that unless we bring in some of those policies. They're going to create those really significant changes.
And it's about transparency there, isn't it? That's kind of the main theme you've been coming back to, is having that transparency at a company level and at a government level to kind of get more just everyone having a bit more information so that they can tackle these types of things with more information behind them. We're almost at the end. I've got one more question before we get to our final one for everyone. So this one is, again, open to all panelists. Do you think that COVID has forced more women to take control over their finances, as opposed to the man of the household being the decision maker? And maybe, Fiona, you've had some experiences there. Or, you've shared some stories about men being a little bit even more dominant than before. So what kind of trends are you noticing there?
I think maybe all of us have had more time to look at those things. So I think some of the data shows that one's taking more time to think about what their financial future should be. And that's a really good thing, but particularly for women, given what we know about where they are financially. So let's hope that continues.
Yeah. Anyone else got any comment on that, or should we move on to our final?
Well, I think it's been a trend that COVID has definitely accelerated the trend, but it is something that we've been seeing, for years before this. Like, we relaunched Yahoo Finance in 2018, and one of our goals was to tap into the massive amount of, surging interest from female Australians who wanted to engage more with their finance. So yeah, that'll be what I would add, that COVID has accelerated it, but I think that there's a lot of bad news out there, but there also is a lot of good news. We are more financially empowered than we have ever been, and I think that we're seeing that play out in terms of financial engagement too.
Awesome. Well, I think we're ready for our last question, which is kind of a summary, open to everyone, of what one tip would you give women for managing their finances in 2021? And I will kick off with my tip, and my tip is simply to engage with your finances you know, a lot of people don't consider themselves money people. They shy away from it, and they don't want to know their budget. I've talked to so many friends about budgets over time, and they say, I don't want a budget. I hate budgets. I can't live with them. And to me, a budget is the opposite. A budget gives you freedom because it shows you where your money is going. You then have your fun money, and then you can spend that knowing that you're not putting yourself into debt, that your head's not in the sand. I always get really cautious when you have a dynamic where there's a couple and either side, whether it's the female or the male, but where one of them controls the money. I think everyone in a relationship, if you share finances, should have oversight. So I guess my big tip is to just make sure you are in the driver's seat of your own financial situation, that you know where your money is going and what it is doing. So that's my tip. Who would like to go next?
I can go next. So my tip is probably a bit more abstract, and it's something that I learnt last year talking to, I think it was, can't remember who it was. I interviewed a lot of women last year, but they were talking about their money stories, and it made me realise that, because I came from a family where we all work for our money. You know, investing wasn't something that we spoke about at the dinner table. It just wasn't who we were, and I grew up realising that, and I hit a point last year where I stopped and I sat down and I really assessed my approach to money, and I realised that I've been going through life thinking, Lucy is an investor. She's not a business owner. Lucy's going to work for her money and she's going to save, and that's how she's going to become financially independent. And it was a really interesting process for me to actually change that and to sit down and go, no, there's nothing stopping you from being someone who does invest and from being someone who does have a passive income, so that if something does go wrong with your job, or there's an illness or something happens, you're going to be, there's a backup plan. So that would be my number one tip, would be to actually sit down with yourself and I guess have a conversation with yourself about how you view money and how you relate to it, and I guess the sort of money person that you think you are. Really answer that question and see if maybe you can be a bit more creative.
And I think, Lucy, it kind of comes back to what you said before when you tried out that app that you were a bit intimidated by, that you thought was going to take too long, and the reality of it was about an hour of just learning and being a little bit out of your comfort zone, but learning something new, and, you know, just engaging with it is a really, really good place to start. Christina, what are your thoughts on this? What is your number one tip for managing money in 2021?
I'm actually going to go for the most boring, disliked financial topic of all time, which is insurance. But I actually think is the most important one that so many people don't have. And I guess working for a superannuation fund, and we're often at the end of the line when people go through severe financial hardship because of, like that Fiona have mentioned, like a partner dying, a partner getting cancer, you know, something else, you know, losing a child, something else traumatic. We're often the people at the end of the line because our members are trying to take out their super to plug that gap, and that's really, really sad and tragic. And so I think insurance is the number one thing. Spend a couple of hours, sit down, write down all the things that you value and treasure in your life, and work out what's the worst thing possible that could happen to that thing, and could you afford to do what you would need to do in that situation? If the answer is no, go and find some insurance for it. Whether that's, I love my dog, what would happen if I had to pay for a $3,000 operation? Or, hey, I love my kids, what would happen if something happened to us? Would they have significant financial security afterwards? I just think it's so important. I actually heard the story of a woman last year who lost both of her arms to sepsis, unable to work, and her and her partner had 6 months before gone through all of their insurances and redone them, and only because they did that, it meant that her husband was able to stop working to be her primary carer. They could fund to remodel the house, and she'd been able to get a support to actually re-enter the workforce. Their lives would have been completely different if they didn't have their insurances in place. So insurance is going to be my big one.
Wow, that could be a life-changing tip right there. I feel like I need to go review my insurances right now. Fantastic. Thank you, Christina. And Fiona, what is your number one tip?
Well, I think I should say all of the above after listening to that very wise advice from you all. But mine is have your own bank account and make sure you've got some savings in it. Even if it's $5 a week, automate that, build up some savings. Having a savings buffer is one of the primary around financial well-being. People feel so much better about their lives generally if you've got a savings buffer behind you and in your own account.
Yes, very, very key.
In your name.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think that's all we have time for today, but I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Lucy, Christina, and Fiona for being on this panel today. It's been such a fantastic discussion and so many great insights from different kind of worlds and industries there coming together. So we really appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for joining us today.